Well, hello everybody. Welcome back to Aquarius Rising Africa. I hope you're all having a fantastic weekend and looking forward to part 3 of the testimony of MK Ultra survivor JR Sweet. Wow, what a testimony we've heard so far. But before we bring JR on, welcome Lisa D, Leanne, Kyle, all you guys. So good to see you. Like, share, subscribe, get the show on the road. And hello, Misty May. And yeah, here we go. Without any further ado, ta-da. JR, so good to see you again. Thank you for joining me. How are you?
I am well, Chantel. Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me on again. I really appreciate it.
It's
Yeah,
such a pleasure. I mean, your story is so, there are no words. There really are no words. And of course, today we're going to be talking about some extremely sensitive topics. So I want to just give a trigger warning up front to any sensitive ears or any survivors that might be triggered. We're going to be talking about the most dangerous game and all sorts of related topics. So either get small little ears out of the room, and just be aware this is specifically triggering today. But really good to have you back, JR, and thank you, because I know, gosh, these topics can never be easy to speak about again and recount in your mind. So thank you again for what you're doing and what you're sharing.
yeah, thank you, Chantel. It isn't easy. Yeah, but it's needed. It's worth it. People have to understand what's going on and what these folks are doing so that they can make educated decisions themselves in their own lives. So,
Absolutely.
yeah,
You were just saying off air a bit that you were only harassed once this week
yeah,
by a flying thing in the sky, helicopter, whatever. So it's like you were saying, for you, just the way that your life is, that's part of your life, and only to be harassed once a week is a blessing, from what I'm hearing, as opposed to 10 times a day. Um, Tell us a little bit before you continue about that. What's that like for you? I mean, you make it sound like it's just a normal day for you, and I guess in your world it probably is, right?
yeah, yeah. It often is a fresh reminder as well. And when I lived in Idaho, we were harassed all the time, my wife included, and my children with aircraft. And we'd have people on the ground harassing us, as well as through telephones, cell phones, things of that nature. You'd get calls from interesting people all the time. And usually you'd try to call them back, and those numbers would be disconnected, and you wouldn't get a hold of anyone. And so, yeah, this week I had a helicopter that followed me for about 25 miles. I was traveling and I went from one state to another, and he followed me across state lines. And yeah, yeah, it's never very comforting to have those things happen, but you
From
do.
from what you know, what are they trying to achieve when they do that? Is it just absolute harassment, just for them to let you know we've got eyes on you? Or are they genuinely keeping track on you and letting you know they're doing that? Because obviously, in their eyes, you're still an asset. So, what is the reason they do that? Or is it just being asses?
All three of those reasons you just defined, Chantel, they are asses, and they're always trying to let you know we're still watching you. And I've been doing a lot of podcasts lately, and I don't think they've been very happy about that. But what we're going to talk about today with coon hunting and the most dangerous game. In that memory, we were chased around by helicopters too. It wasn't just people on the ground. And so it does take you back to that part of your mind when you were being chased by aircraft and really, really, really bad things happened to you. And so it's multiple purposes. People often ask that, even family members would ask that, why do they do this with helicopters? And puts you back in that state of trauma and you have to deal with it. And for me, I understand who they are and what they're doing and the volatility of my situation. And so it is unnerving, but it's also a trigger, is what I would say. And so
that when you said that that was part of what your torture was really, in these games, the coon hunting and the most dangerous game, it would immediately struck me that more than likely they're trying to trigger you as well, with memories. And of course, that whole trauma would then take you, it just takes your whole frequency down. Your entire being becomes stressed. And of course, they know exactly how to create that stress, don't they? To such extreme levels that's how they hold people hostage.
yeah, I try to work through it. I try to deal with it as best I can, not let it slow me down. So yeah, they are annoying. They are asses, Chantel, that's for sure.
Bloody hell, man. Wow. Okay, well, I want to just, before we carry on, I want to just invite those of you who haven't heard JR's testimony prior to tonight. If you haven't heard his testimony yet, please do so. We have 2 previous shows on Aquarius Rising Africa where he kind of explains in sequence his memories, and we pretty much on part 3 tonight. So we're going to see how far we get. We're not going to force anything, and it might be the conclusion, or we might have more after this. We'll just see how far we go. So yeah, JR, thank you. So over to you and coon hunting. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. So the last time we left off, Chantel, we talked about how I was made to make a porn video for Bird at a military installation. And after that event, well, a couple other things happened that I had never written about publicly. One of those is we were hanging out with this guy, and he was a retired sheriff of some kind. And this was in Nashville. And we were hanging out with him, and we went to the, there's that big thing there in Nashville, the Grand Ole Opry. That's what it's called. We went to the Grand Ole Opry and hanging out with the sheriff for a little while. I can remember my grandfather, my cousin, and I, and this gentleman going for a drive. We had to go to the store. And so we went to the store, and my grandpa and this guy, they started talking up in the front seat. And this guy, he asked my grandpa how it was going with the CIA kids. And me and my cousin were like, what are you talking about? And my cousin started saying, Grandpa, you're in the CIA and all this stuff. And we started asking questions, and my grandpa got really frustrated and kind of yelled at the guy and was like, they're not supposed to remember this stuff, And so my cousin, somehow badges came up, do you have a badge, Grandpa? And my grandpa said, yeah, I got a badge. And he said, I'll show it to you. And he didn't have a badge. He had a stun gun, and he turned around in the seat and he hit me and my cousin with it and fried us really good. And then I remember waking up in the car later because it knocked me unconscious. And I woke up in the car later, and we went to the store. And when we came out, my cousin, he didn't wake up for a while. He was still out. And Just stood there and smoked a cigarette. I was 15, and I was there with my grandpa and the sheriff guy, and we're out there smoking cigarettes. And so that was something that I've been working through. And that guy, there's a lot of corrupt people in law enforcement. And when I was made to go to Oklahoma and play the most dangerous game after Nashville, we went and stayed with another individual who was also ex-law enforcement. I believe he was ex-law enforcement at that time. And his name was Strong, Robert Strong. And we stayed at his house there. And to me, I just thought he was friends with my grandpa and my grandma, him and his wife. And we stayed there at their house, and we did some fun things, but we just spent a lot of time there hanging out. And I can remember Bob, he had horses, and he had a dog. And he said his dog was a good hunting dog. And him and my grandpa said they would take my cousin and I coon hunting one of the mornings we were staying there. And my cousin and I were like, oh, great, To me, it was kind of weird because I know about hunting licenses and stuff. And I was like, well, don't we need a hunting license for these things? And they said, no, you won't need a hunting license. We'll be on private property. And so the day came when we all loaded up into the truck. It was early morning. We got up. I don't remember eating anything. We just got in the truck, and they started driving, and they drove us some distance out of town. I don't know how far. We were outside Vicey, Oklahoma is where we were staying. It was outside Vicey. And they drove us, I don't know how far, and finally turned off onto this road leading off onto this property. And after a little ways into the property, there was a gate, and there was an armed guard there, and he was wearing BDUs, and he was in military style clothing, and he had an assault weapon with him. And he led us through the gate. My grandfather talked to him for a minute, and Bob, and they led us through. And then we went further, and we ended up coming upon this house. There was this big house, huge house with this big field of grass out in front of it. And then there was a parking lot, a big circular style parking lot, and some ag looking buildings. And there were these vehicles there, and you could see that there were some helicopters there, these little black helicopters. And we pulled into that. My cousin had fallen asleep again. He had slept on the drive in because he was tired. And so we pulled in, and I saw this. Well, my cousin woke up and he saw it, and he didn't know what to make of it all. And my grandfather and Bob, they got out of the truck, and then my cousin and I were made to get out of the truck. And we just stood there for a little while, and my grandpa, they were explaining who some of the people that were there were, and the Ford family was there. That's the Ford family. They make Ford automobiles. And then I can remember that the Hiltons were there, Richard Hilton with Paris and Nikki. And then they had somebody else was there that was involved in the country music industry. And I'd run into them later down in, I believe, New Mexico, because we went to one of their music shows. It was this big country music family. And one of the younger people in that family was being made to play the game as well, run in the game, I should say. And then there was also this big van load of orphans, just people from an orphanage, children that didn't have parents, that didn't have anyone, and they were there. And we were all the order came for all the kids to strip naked. And so we were all made to strip naked. And I can remember taking my clothes off, and they were put away in the truck. And my cousin did the same thing. And all of the young people there, all the kids, they were all made to strip naked. And then the game began. And first one I can remember running was the Ford kid. And he he was made to run, and he ran, and he was this skinny kid, and he ran out and across the grass in front of the house, and there was a bunch of trees on the other side of the grass, and he went over into the trees and he disappeared. And then, so we were all sent in groups or individuals. And so the next people I can remember going was Nikki and Paris. They were made to run, and they ran. And then my cousin and I were made to run. And we started running out across there, and it was just beyond scary. We were just running, and I can remember the Hilton girls being in front of us, and they were still in the grass, and they looked like something was going on. And as we got closer, it looked like one of them had injured themselves. I believe Nikki had injured her ankle, is what happened. And Paris was trying to help her, and I don't know what I was thinking, but I wanted to help because this whole thing was bad, and I knew it was all bad. And so I started heading towards the girls to help them, and we're all just stark ass naked out there. And I just started to head towards them, and when I started to head towards them, I started hearing gunshots, and I could hear bullets go above my head. And this was unnerving, to say the least. And I turned around, and I could see my cousin coming up behind me. He was smaller than me, and he was waving his arms, and he was just screaming, "Run, run, run." And I didn't know what else to do. I just started running. We both just ran, and we left the girls there, and we ran off into the trees. I don't remember seeing the Hilton girls again at that event. We ran and we went into the trees, and we were in the trees. I don't know how long we ran, Chantel. We were there, and we just kept moving. You could hear gunshots. You could hear dogs. I will add, everyone had dogs at this event. All the people that had come for it, the Hiltons, the Richard, he had 2 dogs. And then my grandfather and Robert, they brought the 1 dog. And you could hear the dogs barking. We lasted for a while. I can remember we came across this little girl, and she was in the trees, and she was hiding. She was just curled up, trying to hide. She wasn't doing very well at it. And my cousin and I, we came up to her and we said, you can't stay here. You have to keep going. You can't stay. This is not good. You have to keep moving, or they're going to find you. And so we got her to come with us. And we just kept moving, and you could hear the helicopters. You could hear the dogs. You could hear the shooting. You could hear the screaming. And we could tell they were getting close to us at one point. They were getting really close. The helicopters were getting close, the dogs. And so my cousin had this great idea. There was a shallow body of water, like a pond. And we got into that pond, and there were these reeds, and we broke the reeds up, and we were able to use them for straws. And we hid under the water, and we tried to breathe through these reeds. I can remember it didn't last too long. They could see us. They could see us from the helicopter, and they started yelling at us in the water, and we stood up. And my grandpa, Bob was on the radio. Bob was on the ground, and he was with these 2 guys. And I don't know how many guys. He was with some other people, and he had his dog, and he had his gun, and he was talking to my grandfather. He was up in the helicopter, in the bird, and he said to my grandpa over the radio, he said they have a girl with them. And my grandpa said something to the effect of, "Well, who is it?" And he said, "It's one of the orphans." And my grandpa just yelled out, "You shoot that." I don't know that I should swear. He said, "You shoot her," in not so nice terms. And Bob did. Bob just shot her right there in front of us, Chantel. And I would imagine she's dead now, but they just shot her. And then they dragged us out of the pond, and we were just naked and just completely traumatized by what we were going through. And they dragged us out of the water and they dragged us to a clearing out in the field. There was this field there. And they showed no mercy on us other than, I suppose, we weren't killed, but we were raped out in the field, and they used the dog. They'll do things like that. They used the dog to rape us. It was horrible. And I can remember my grandpa landing in the helicopter, and he got out and he came over, and they all just did horrible, horrible things to us. And when they were done with us, they threw us in the back of this small little pickup. And I can remember the dog was in the pickup still. They brought the dog with them. And they drove us back over to the house. And when we got back to the house, my grandfather made my cousin and I take a shower. They had an outdoor shower. Now this house, this estate, it was owned by a senator, a U.S. senator. And I don't know his name. I don't know who it was. I just know it was a U.S. senator. And they'll do things like that. They'll use different properties in the states. So we see people that are, we call wealthy and rich, and they use their properties for things like this. And that's part of how they do it. And so we were made to shower, and then my grandfather had taken a rifle from the property. He had this little M1 carbine, I can remember, and he had to put it back in the gun cabinet and make sure it was cleaned up. And then they walked us back out to the truck, and we left. And then that morning we got back to the house, to Bob's farm, and they fed us a breakfast, a really big breakfast, because we hadn't eaten. And they fed us, and I ended up getting really sick off of that meal, because in all this, they'd also electrocuted us and hit us with a stun gun and put us through the ringer. And so I got really sick after this. But that was a horrible event, and that was a lot of people call that the most dangerous game. We didn't go coon hunting. My cousin and I were the coons. And so that's part of the depth of evil these folks will go to in this upside down world that they create around themselves. And that was part of an initiation as well, I believe, into my being sold to Senator Byrd, because this was the year that I'd been sold as a trauma-based mind slave to Byrd. And so I can remember after that, we went down south, and after that, I can remember ending up in Dallas, Texas. These aren't things that you're going to find written about in my book or on my website, but we were taken down to Dallas, and then we met up with Byrd down there. And Byrd, him and my grandpa, they were friends and associates, and they just sat and talked for a while. And his wife was there too, Byrd's wife, and they all just sat in the hotel and talked for, I don't know how long, seems like a couple hours. And then Byrd took my cousin and I with him and his wife. We dropped his wife off at their hotel there in Dallas. And then he took us out to a military installation in Fort Worth, Texas. And he put us through some programming there on the base. It was a naval base. Navy comes up a lot in these things. And so we were taken to a naval base where he worked on our programming and tortured us some. And he worked on our voice programming, I can remember in particular there. And I believe that's where he chipped me. as well, put a chip in me. So, but I haven't worked through all those things completely, so I don't talk about that experience a whole lot. But that is what I can remember very clearly, and I have written all that out, so I'm very confident in my experience there at Fort Worth. But the next memory that people can read about is sometime later in 1995. In 1995, see, I was raised in the Mormon Church, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And the Mormon Church always comes into play with these things for me because the church was involved with these things. And so I was made to be in a presentation, essentially, is what I would call it, for a man named Gordon B. Hinckley. And he had just become the president of the Mormon Church in 1995. And Gordon wanted to know what the Central Intelligence Agency was doing with the kids from the satanic family bloodlines that the CIA was using, because the CIA will pull from the satanic family bloodlines that the church actively works at finding and keeping hidden. And Gordon wanted to know, what are you doing with these kids? And he had reached the level at the top of the church where he could be given that information. And so myself and another individual who was a friend of mine, we were brought in to do a presentation for him. This occurred in Haley, Idaho, at my uncle's home. My uncle, Gail Pooley, was my CIA handler, and his connections went up very high in the church. And he had called me. It was spring break, 1995, and my uncle had called me at home at the beginning of spring break and said, "What are you doing for spring break?" He said, "I want you to come up to my house because the president of the church, Gordon B. Hinckley, is going to be speaking in Haley at our ward, and I want you to come up and you can hear him." And I said, "Okay." And I talked to him about bringing my brother, my older brother, because my older brother was going to be going on a mission for the church. He was coming on age for that. And I thought it'd be a good experience for my older brother. Well, my uncle said, "No, you're coming up here with Chris Knutson, who was another trauma-based mind slave that I was good friends with. They'd pair us together sometimes." And so I said, "Okay." And Chris had a decent car, and so he was going to drive us. We lived in Nampa at that time, which is about 3.5 hours from Haley. And so the next morning, well, it wasn't until mid-afternoon or so, we drove up there, Chris and I, in his vehicle, and we went and stayed at my uncle's house. And we stayed down in the basement in a room that was right across from his office. He had his office down in the basement. And then across the hall was his wife's craft room. A lot of people are into crafts and stuff like that. And so they made room in there for us. And that's where Chris and I slept. But we didn't get to sleep very much that night. My uncle had told us to come over to the office at some point during the night. I forget what time, but he told us to come over there and not just go to sleep. And so that night we hung out in that room for a while, and then we went over and knocked on the door and we went into his office. Well, my grandfather was there. My grandfather is someone who is involved in my programming and abuse throughout much of my life. And Grandpa was in there and he was reading from scriptures, and I'm not sure exactly what he was reading, but he was reading from scripture, and he told us to come in and made us just stand there. And they proceeded to just, basically they were prepping us for the presentation the following day. And so my grandfather tortured us. He made us do all kinds of sexual things. And I can remember very distinctly, he had a cattle prod, an electric cattle prod, And yeah, it was horrible. And he used that electrical cattle prod on us. My uncle, another one of my uncles, I don't know how much he knew, but he ran a dairy farm. And so my grandpa had just asked him for a cattle prod. And so, yeah, that was really bad. And so they tortured us all night and we're working on our programming for the following day. We didn't get hardly any sleep. And then we ended up back in the room. And I can remember just feeling awful the next day, just terrible. I woke up and was just confused. What had happened to me? Why do I feel so horrible? And got out of bed, went out in the hall, and in the hall, I don't think Chris was in the room anymore. He'd already gotten up, and my uncle met me in the hall, and he said, after sacrament meeting, I want you to come back to the house and come down to the basement. We got to do something down here. And he showed me this handshake. It was supposed to be what would get me into his office when I came back. And he showed me this handshake and he said, I would need you to remember this because this is how you're going to get in the office. They won't let you in unless you know it. And so he showed me the handshake and I didn't get it. I felt so out of it and so fried from the night before. I was like, oh no, I don't know if I get it. And he showed me again and he just said, you got it, you got it. And then out he went. He went back up the stairs and he was headed off to the church meeting because he was the bishop of that ward. And so that's like the highest level in that area of a town for that church. So the church has all these different wards and branches, and he was the bishop of that ward in Haley. And so he had to get there, and everybody had left by the time I got upstairs, and Chris was there, and Chris and they told us to fast too. We weren't allowed to eat or drink anything. In the Mormon church, you're always fasting. And it goes hand in hand with trauma-based mind control programming, where you're not supposed to eat. You're supposed to be kept in a state of just on this line of where you're suffering. And so we weren't allowed to eat that morning or drink anything. But Chris, he was a rebellious spirit sometimes. And I can remember after the meeting, he did eat something. But regardless, we ended up going to sacrament meeting to the church, and I can remember going in and we sat down in the church and we sat at the very back. They had opened up, the church has all these different things they can open to make the rooms bigger, these accordion style things. And they had opened up one of those doors. And so the whole thing, it was really crowded and packed. And so we sat down in the back and it was really weird. Hinckley wasn't there when we got there, Chantel. And we just sat there and sacrament went on. And for a while, I don't know, maybe 15 minutes, 20 minutes before Hinckley showed up. And then when he showed up, they didn't just come in the normal doors. They came in through this side door entrance that's typically, I believe, for emergencies. And so they came in through this side door up by the front, and Hinckley was surrounded by this entourage of people that looked to me like bodyguards. And I can remember finding that so odd that the leader of the church would need all this security around him. And he came in and he went up and he sat next to my uncle because, like I said, my uncle was the bishop. And so he was sitting up at the front right behind the pulpit. And Hinckley went up and he sat right there next to my uncle. And everything had stopped when Hinckley came in, and everyone was supposed to be respectful. And what is the term they use? I forget. We had to be good Mormons. And so he came in and he sat down and we were all quiet. And then after that, everything kind of continued until Hinckley was going to speak. And I can remember sitting there and my uncle and Hinckley were just chatting it up there at the front. And I was like, wow, what is going on? How does my uncle know all these people? My uncle always knew all these people, and they were just sitting there chatting it up. You could just sit there and watch them. And then at some point they quit talking. And I can remember my uncle looking out across this whole crowd of people right at me. And then he winked at me. And this freaked me out. I was like, oh my, did he just wink at me? Why would he wink at me? Because my base personality, I couldn't understand what was going on. And I couldn't remember what had happened to me the night before. And I was just in my base personality again. And so Hinckley finally got up and he gave his talk. And, you know, I was a young Mormon and I was in my base personality. And Chantel, I had expected for that man to give the most profound talk I had ever heard in my entire life, because that's what I had perceived would happen. He's supposed to be a man of God. Well, he gave one of the most mundane talks that it just sounded like everyday church. I was like, well, what was that exactly? And then after he gave his talk, he sat down and he talked to my uncle a little more. And then he got up and he left. And all of his security left with him. And they went out that same side door that they had come in. So this was all kind of strange to me. And after church, sacrament finally ended and everyone started going to their different classes. Well, we were supposed to go back to the house, but I felt off about it. I felt like something was wrong. Something's going on. And so I went and I found my cousin, who is my uncle's daughter, the bishop. And I went to her and I said, are you coming back to the house too? Do you know what's going on? And she said, I'm not going back to the house. What are you talking about? And she acted like the whole thing was weird that I would even ask her that. And I was like, well, okay. So I told Chris, I guess we're just going back to the house. Let's go see what's going on. And so he drove his car up there, Mercury Cougar. That's what he drove, this big, long Mercury Cougar. You remember those things? Yeah, it was in good condition too. But he drove us back up there. And we parked, and I don't remember anybody being parked outside. It was all very strange. And we went inside. And when we went inside, this is where Chris broke his fast. He went right into the kitchen and he got out a loaf of bread out of the cupboard. And it was a loaf, I believe it was French bread. It was just this big loaf of bread. And he took it with him. And so we went down the stairs and we went to the door and I knocked on the door, and then the door opened and this hand came out. And I tried to shake the hand with the correct handshake, but I was wrong. And my uncle had not taken enough care to get me to remember it. These people can be lazy too. The CIA thinks they have all this down perfect, but really they don't. They're all lazy. And yeah, I won't go off on that, but he hadn't gone through it enough with me. And so I couldn't remember. And the door just closed and the hand went back in, door closed. And I was like, oh no, I could hear this talking in there and murmuring. And I was like, uh-oh, this is not good. Well, Chris, he said, get out of the way. And he knocked on the door and the hand came out and he shook it. And he knew the handshake because my uncle had shown it to him as well before he had left for church. And so Chris was able to do the correct handshake and they led us into the room. When we went into the room, there was a lot of people in there. There was the people that had escorted Gordon B. Hinckley, I could see, were in the room. All these people in suits, crowded into the room. And someone was sitting at my uncle's desk, but the chair was turned around backward. And my uncle was standing there next to the chair by the desk. And he said, come in, boys, come in. There's someone I want you to meet. And then the individual in the chair slowly turned around, and it was Gordon B. Hinckley. And he said, I want you to meet Gordon. And so we walked up and shook hands with Gordon. And I can remember that Chris, he was blown away. He was like, oh, wow. And he just went out of his way to shake hands with Gordon. Well, this made all the security team really nervous because he was pushing through trying to shake Gordon's hand. And then that made them all nervous. And then after that, we were made to stand at attention. That was something that had been drilled into me my whole life. So I was raised in the project in a military family, and it's as though I was raised in the military. I understand those commands, stand at attention. They're programmed into us. And so I stood at attention along with Chris. And my uncle went into the presentation and he started to explain that we were CIA trauma-based mind slaves, and that we were both owned by Senator Byrd and the agency. And he explained how we could be, he explained our family bloodlines to Gordon. He talked about the abuse that we'd been through. And then he talked about all the things we could be used for. And he talked about how we could be used for blackmail, how we could be used for sexual exploitation, how we could be used for assassinations, how we were good at dying and keeping quiet, and how we could tolerate torture and being tortured. And then he also talked about how I was skilled at what's called remote viewing. And so that's something that I am able to do, and it still happens on occasion. And so he talked about that. And then I can remember my uncle telling Chris and I to strip naked. He said, take your clothes off. The first thing he said was, take your clothes off. Now, when you're dealing with trauma-based mind slaves, you have to be so direct in your orders. He said, take your clothes off. So I removed my clothing and I left my underpants on. And I can remember at that time, I had these giant underpants. They were military surplus underpants, boxers, and they were huge. I don't know why I wore those things, but at that age I did. And we took our clothes off, and he said, no, all of them. I want all your clothes off. And so we were made to take off our underpants as well and be completely naked. And then he talked about how we could be used, how we could switch personalities, I should say. And he switched us into a homosexual personality and made Chris and I perform homosexual acts right there in front of Gordon. And after he had done that, we covered assassinations. I was made to get on my knees. He talked about how we would die for our country and how we would kill for our country. And I was made to get on my knees, and Chris held a knife to my throat. My uncle had a couple knives there in the room, and Chris held a knife to my throat, and I was just there naked on my knees, and Chris had that knife to my throat, and he started to actually stick it into my neck, and I could feel the blood running down. And I was like, oh my God, what is going on? Because in the project, Chantel, you don't know when you've done something to piss somebody off and they're actually going to get rid of you, because I have seen so many people murdered in the project. And I didn't know, did I do something? Is my uncle going to have me killed? Is it my time? And so all I could think to do was to turn my neck to show him I'm bleeding and Chris is about to kill me. And he saw that finally in between talking to Gordon. And he said, Chris, don't kill Johnny. We're not going to kill him right now. And I was relieved to hear that. You even in a state of trauma, I still had things going through my head like, oh my God, are they going to kill me? And he said, we're not going to kill Johnny. And so the knife was taken away from my throat. And Gordon, he wanted to know, well, how do you keep them from talking? How do you know they won't talk? And we were made to walk up to the desk. I was made to get off my knees, and I walked up to the desk, Chris and I, and we're still naked. And one of the programming that they put us through was that we would cut off our own genitals if we ever even thought about talking. And so there was another knife on the table. Chris already had a knife, and I took that knife and I was made to hold that to my male genitalia, and we just waited for the command to cut our own male genitalia off. And in the state of mind I was in, I would have done exactly what I was told. And that command never came. We were told to put the knives down. And then after that, they wanted to demonstrate torture and how we could sustain torture without making a sound and without being forced to talk. And so there was this guy there in his security entourage. He was this older gentleman. He had this really short military style haircut. And Hinckley wanted someone to torture us that he could really trust to actually do it. And so this guy was selected, and the rule was you weren't allowed to scar us. You weren't allowed to leave physical things that people could actually see. Yeah, and so we were made to go to this individual, and he took us and he basically manipulated our arms and bent them around and just bent us around to the point where anyone would have broken. It was horrible. And in my mind, I was programmed to deal with these things. It's part of what's called Tin Man programming. And my tin man programming kicked in, and I can remember saying over and over and over and over in my head, this too shall pass, this too shall pass, this too shall pass. And I just dealt with it and didn't make sound. And then after we'd both been tortured and Hinckley was satisfied with what he'd seen, I was made to perform remote viewing for him. And Hinckley, he was skeptical through all of this. And he said, I want you to show me remote viewing. And so I was made to go into a state of trance, and I was made to remote view for Gordon. And he said he wanted me to tell him where his wife was. And I said, okay. And so I went into this state of trance, and I was able to remote view his wife. And I told him she's at church, and she's sitting there at church right now. And he laughed at me, and he said, no kidding. She is the wife of the prophet. She had better be at church. And then he said, what is she wearing? And I said, she's wearing a very specific scarf. And it was around her neck, and I could see it. And when I told him that, he believed, because he had given her that scarf, and she wore it every time he was away, and she would go to church without him. And so I was able to view that. And then after that, they were done with us, and they started to leave. Everyone left. And I can remember even at that time, I was just so messed up in my head. I was just like, bye, everybody. And they just looked at me like I was some kind of freak. But I wasn't the one that was there to watch a CIA kid do all these things. So they all left. My uncle was very happy with the presentation, how it had gone. And he put us through hypnosis. He hit us with the stun gun. He fooled Chris with the stun gun. He said, do you want to see something cool? I have it here in my cabinet. And he just fried the hell out of us. And then after they were done with that, he just sent us back to church. And so we were made to go back to church, and we finished out the rest of the 3 hours church goes on for, or it did at that time in the LDS church. Well, after that, Chris wasn't very happy being there. He didn't want to stay at my aunt and uncle's house. We ended up leaving the house. There's more to the story. People can read about it on my website or in my book. But Chris didn't want to stay another night. He wanted to leave. The next place he wanted to go was his father's house. His father and his mother were divorced. And during the presentation with Hinckley, my uncle had told Hinckley we were both going to go see Chris's father. Chris's father worked at a place called INEL, Idaho National Environmental Laboratories. It's part of the energy department. Now they call it INL, Idaho National Laboratories. And there's a human bioprogramming facility there. It's there's a bunch of deprivation tanks that were designed by John C. Lilly that are located at that site. And my uncle had told Hinckley how we were going to be sent to INEL and we were going to be put through what's called suicide programming. And so we left my uncle's house that night because Chris didn't want to stay another night there. And we drove to Idaho Falls where his father lived. And we ended up arriving. It was pretty late, probably around midnight or something. And we got there and his dad was surprised to see us, but he let us in. And I can just remember going in and going to sleep. It's interesting that at times in my life I could remember going and hearing Gordon talk, and at other times I couldn't. When I started to remember things in 2017, I was like, oh my God, why did I hear the prophet of the church speak? What happened there? It's so weird because things would just start coming back. And that was my experience of going and meeting Gordon for the first time. I believe that was the only time I met Gordon, but I'm not entirely sure of that. I would later go to Salt Lake City when I got older in 1998. I was supposed to meet with Gordon, but I ended up meeting with Monson, and we'll get into that here in a little while. But I want to talk about INEL for a minute. And so we stayed with Chris's dad. It was the week of spring break, like I said, and we just hung out there for a few days. I'm not sure how many days. And just hung out. It was really boring. We were both recovering. We both were sick. We just had to recover from everything we were put through. And then I can remember his dad telling us he was going to take us to Kids Day at Work Day, and he was going to take us to work with him at INEL. And at one point during our stay there, we were abused by his dad. His dad was a homosexual pedophile, incestual pedophile. And there was one day where he came home from work early and he abused us. And it was really bad. And I was a trauma-based mind slave. I'd been used in pornography for all of my life. And I was used to getting switched into those personalities. And he abused us. And then I can remember him taking us to INEL. And that was a drive across the desert. INEL is a ways from Idaho Falls. So did you need to ask something, Chantel?
Sure. Are you okay? That's what I want to know. Are you okay?
Yeah.
I mean, this is so crazy. This is so crazy. You know, we've heard about the child hunting and stuff like that. A lot of survivors have spoken about it as well, either being part of it or watching it. I cannot imagine the amount of trauma that must be for you and every other child. So I have to say my heart absolutely breaks when I hear that and what you guys have been through. I find it particularly, I don't even know if there's a word for what I feel right now when you speak about this Gordon Hinckley, who's head of the LDS Church, and the way they manipulate the word of God. You know, it's like you were saying your grandfather was, or your uncle, one of the two, I don't quite remember, reading scriptures.
Yeah, grandpa.
You know, reading scriptures, and then, you know, while you guys, or preparing for you guys to be abused. And no doubt, while you're being abused, this is also going on. It is such a...
It's a bad
what is
deal.
the word? What is the word? There is... debased is just not... I mean, I can't even begin to comprehend what that must be, you know? I find it absolutely heartbreaking and heart-wrenching. And I know that we spoke about, you know, the Hilton sisters as well. I'm sure I'll probably get also to you, Nikki, later. But It brings me also to the thought of Paris Hilton, not too long ago, what was it, maybe 4 years ago now, that she came out and spoke about how she was taken off in the middle of the night and sent to this boarding school because she was this problem kid. I believe that was probably part of the mind control. I mean, all of us on these platforms, I'm sure, will understand that the Hiltons would have gone through a lot of SRA in their lives as well. So this wasn't a random once-off thing that she was a bad girl and now being sent to this place that turns out to be quite toxic. Is this common amongst like the bloodlines and the elites that they would get there, do this sort of thing? But again, that's like a cover story. We're talking, about Paris Hilton. So there's a lot of these cover stories out there, right? Pretending to be not nearly as bad as what it is.
Yeah, there is. And it's an illusion. They are good at creating illusions and storylines for those people to cover that up. It comes out in little ways. And Britney Spears is a good example of that, because I know that she was also in the project. And you'll see her programming trying to come out in different ways when she posts videos about just crazy shit that you're like, man, what is wrong with her? Well, if you understand trauma-based mind control and repressed memory, you'll understand what Brittany's going through. And
Absolutely.
so I have a lot of empathy for her, because she's been through hell. And the Paris and Nikki, the same thing. And it's terrible. Just like I was talking about the Ford family being involved with the most dangerous game. There were also families in Ketchum, Idaho, an area I was raised in and worked in as well, where you had very, very wealthy elite families that were involved with it. But they don't just do wealthy elite families. It's whoever they can get. And it might be a bloodline that doesn't have a bunch of money, but it's still from a bloodline. And so they still want those kids. But yeah, the satanic elite are very into this stuff. And one of the reasons they love being involved with the CIA is because it gives them immunity. They are protected under laws. I believe we talked about that already. They're protected under the 1947 National Security Act and the 1949 Central Intelligence Agency Act, 2 acts that need to be repealed because they're covering up a lot of sin of these families. And so there are a lot of people involved in this. Yeah. So, yeah, it is a bad deal. There's a lot of people involved in it. But the programming I was put through at INEL, it was suicide programming. So after I had met with Gordon and we'd done that presentation, Chris and I, we stayed at his father's place, and then we were taking kids day at work, and we were taken to the facility, and we were taken to a very specific building on the facility. I can remember going through several gates, several armed guards, and we got to this spot on the base, or at the facility, I should say. And David parked the car, and then we got out of the car. And I can remember when we got out of the car, Chantel, Chris and I were multiples. When we got out of the car, I saw a whole different Chris than I had ever seen knowing him. He stood tall. He stood proud. He was confident. He'd been through these things at this facility before. And I don't know why he switched into that personality, but he did. And it was interesting to see it. And then we went into this building, and there was an area, it was like a vestibule room. And there was this window leading into another little room where there were these 2 ladies in there. And we had to sign in. This was the sign-in desk. And all this stuff, it's all a big loop, because I can remember these ladies talking about the gassing of the Tokyo subway system, which occurred on March 20th of 1995. And so the events we're talking about are shortly after the gassing of the Tokyo subway system by the Aum Shinrikyo cult. And that's going to come up later, because I was brought in on an operation after I'd passed my Pentagon level black ops testing. I was used for assassinations, and I was used in the assassination of Masaru Takumi. And so we'll get to that later, but we had to sign in and go into this facility. And so we signed in, and we were taken through these doors and taken back into this facility. It's all a little cloudy in there. I can remember going to some rooms, some different places, and then we ended up in this big room where there were just so many deprivation tanks. I don't even know how many. Several dep tanks, and they were getting too ready. There were these people there in lab coats, and they were getting something ready. There was a control panel, all these wires, these tanks, and there was a ladder that led up to them. They had these roll around ladders, something you'd see in a warehouse or something, and then there were these benches down below. And we were made to strip naked again. And then they put us in these wetsuits. And I'd been measured for this wetsuit at some time before. My aunt and uncle had made me go to a doctor visit with them. I can't remember why. I need to work that out. And we measured out my body for this wetsuit at that doctor visit. And so this wetsuit, it was so tight. I was like, I can't fit into it. It's too tight. And they said, no, you have been fitted to this wetsuit. It's important you squeeze into this thing. And so I did. I squeezed into it. And on that wetsuit were these electrodes. And those electrodes, they were located all around on this wetsuit. And it was like a copper pad on the inside. But then on the outside, there was something you could plug these wires into to send currents into your body at specific locations. And they made me climb up the ladder after I got my wetsuit on. And then Chris, he was taken to another one. He had to go up into his depth tank. And once we got up to the top, I can remember there were these two guys there, and they reminded me of Tweedledum and Tweedledee from Alice in Wonderland. They were twins, and they were identical twins, and they were super smart. They were wizards at electrical stuff, electrical engineering, and they were the ones that worked on all this electrical stuff in conjunction with the deprivation tanks. The dep tanks had been designed by Dr. John C. Lilly. He's an individual that comes in and out of my life a lot. I knew John. He was not a very good man, but he was intelligent. And so John had designed the dep tanks, but these guys worked on the electrical components, and they hooked me all up to this electrical stuff. I remember having a mask, being put in the water to breathe. It wasn't water, though. It was some kind of solution. And we were put in there. And when I went down in and I went under, I can remember them saying, because you could hear them talking to you through the solution, and they said, we're going to play a game. And the game is you're not allowed to move, not a muscle. I don't want you to move at all. And so I was like, well, that's going to be easy. I can just hang here and not move. Well, no, any movement, anything. And so they just basically fried the hell out of me. I don't know for how long. I just started getting shocked. And then the more you're getting shocked, the more you're moving. And they just fried me in that tank until I couldn't move. I couldn't move. I was just done. Just a vegetable hanging there. And then they said, okay, now we're gonna take you over the rainbow, and we are gonna push you to a point where your heart stops. And I was a vegetable. I had no control over any of it. And they started to run these electrical currents through, and then my heart, I can remember it stopping, Chantel, and it stopped and everything went black. And then I floated out of my body. I left. My consciousness left my body, my spirit. And I was above my body and I was above the depth tanks, and I could look down and I could see the people working on their electrical. I could see my body. I could see Chris. And then I heard this sound, and it sounded like a freight train coming from behind. And I looked up and I could see this tunnel, and it was coming, and it was coming at me. And I said, oh, crap. And I tried yelling at everybody below me because I'd been pushed out of my body before through trauma. They'll put you through such extreme trauma that you will literally be pushed out of your body. And I'd had that happen to me before in my past. And so I was accustomed to being pushed out. But when I saw that tunnel coming, it was a moment of, oh no, I'm dead and I'm not coming back. And so the tunnel came, and the next thing I remember is just waking up all of a sudden in this, what I would describe as a high mountain meadow. I was all of a sudden standing in the most beautiful, incredible place imaginable, Chantel. And everything around me was alive. It was energy. Everything was energy. Everything was color. And I felt home. I felt like I was at home. I was back where I was supposed to be. And it was just an incredible experience. Everything was alive. There was grass that was alive, and it was just color and energy and trees, and everything was just alive, and it was incredible. And I was so happy. And then I can remember someone saying something to me, and all of a sudden someone was there. And they said, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. And this was an individual that was familiar to me. It was my uncle James. And he had died before this event. And he's my guardian angel now, because I've run into him again before in bad situations. And he said, what are you doing here? You're not supposed to be here. And I said, they sent me here. I don't know. And he said, did you kill yourself? And I said, no, I didn't kill myself. He was very concerned that I killed myself. And I said, no, I didn't do that. They sent me here. And he said, well, you're not supposed to be here. I have to take you to someone to talk to so you can explain why you're here. And I said, okay. And he just took me by the hand, and we just flew. We didn't have bodies. We were in spirit form, and we flew. And we flew for a while over just this beautiful place, the most incredible place. And I can remember seeing us coming up on this huge mountainous valley, this giant bowl thing. And there was all this light coming out of that valley. And we started coming into it. And we landed, and it was some kind of a city. I don't quite know how to describe it. All the buildings were translucent. You could see through them, and all the light came from all of the people there. All of the spirits emanated this beautiful aura and this beautiful light. And my uncle said, just stand right here, and I want you to wait. And he had to go in this building. Something I'd like to add is these buildings were made out of a translucent material, but the architecture was very Greek Roman. I don't understand these things. That's just what I remember, is that it was very Greek Roman, and it was just beautiful and awe-inspiring. And there were doors, and he went in this building, and I waited, and then he came and got me. And when he took me inside, a lot of people came to see me, Chantel, because when you pass away, they hear about it. They hear you're there. And all these folks, they came to see me. And some of them were people that I had been made to kill for the church and for my family and for the agency. And those people, they said to me, they said, we know that you didn't do what you did to us, but that you were made to do it. And we forgive you, because they knew I carried a heavy weight in my soul from having been made to do those things. I was made to kill in my time more than 20 people. And a lot of them came to see me, and they forgave me. And that was incredible. And I met with some other people, and then they took me to a room. And in this room, there was an individual. It's strange, but he was someone that is talked about in the Bible. And I think I know who it is, but I don't say, because I don't want to be wrong. And I think I know, but until I am 100% positive, I don't like to say things. But I met an individual. The reason he was an important individual is because he served. It wasn't because he owned stuff. It wasn't because he drove a fancy car. It wasn't because of his house. It was because he served. He served the children. He served the spirits.
Right.
That's what he did. And that's why he was important. And I met with this guy. And when I met with him, everyone came with me. There's no secrets there. The best thing about that place is truth reigns. You can't hide anything. Anything. It's all truth. They know your life and what is going on, but at the same time they don't. It's all this really weird dynamic that I don't understand, because they were like, what are you doing here? How did you get here? They didn't know. And I had to tell them how I'd gotten there and what had happened to me. And in the end, he said, well, you have to go back. And I said, no, I don't want to go back. I'm not going back. And he said, no, you have to go back. He said, your friends need you. And so I had to come back. And it was just like that. Just boom, I was back. And I was floating above my body. And I could see the depth tank. And I could see the technicians. And it hurt so bad when I came back into my body. I was just pulled back in because they started to hit my heart with electricity and fire it up again. And I came back and I woke up, and something was happening. Something was happening to Chris. He didn't wake up right. Something happened, and he was flailing around in his tank. And they got me out of my tank, and one of the technicians just said, I got to go help the other team. And he left the other guy to help get me unhooked and get me disconnected from everything. And then he ran over to Chris's tank, and I finally got down off of mine. And during all this, one of the head technicians, his daughter worked there. She was older. She was probably in her mid-20s, early 20s. And they'd gotten her a job there at INL. A lot of these things will run in the family. And so this young woman had gotten a job there. And I can remember being made to take my sweatsuit off. And I was just standing there, and she was supposed to be helping me. But she was in a state of trauma too, because of watching what was happening to Chris. They finally got Chris out of the tank, got him down, and he wouldn't come conscious again. They were performing CPR. They were trying to bring him back, but he wouldn't come back. And I was in a state of trauma. I'd just come back from being dead. And this young woman was in a state of trauma from watching all these things. And then Chris finally coughed up a bunch of fluid, and then he just let out this scream, the most horrible, horrible scream imaginable. And he came back. And the tension just kind of left the room. It was like, oh my, he's going to live. He's probably going to live now. And so they got him disconnected from everything, got him out of his wetsuit, and then they started to haul us out of there because they didn't want us dying in their facility. They did not want Chris in particular dying in their facility. And so they started to just haul him out. They got him dressed again. I got dressed. They just started hauling Chris out, and his father was carrying him and another one of the twins. And when they got to a certain door, I can remember the twin, his brother back there yelling at him to come back and help him. And he just looked at me and he said, "You're going to have to help carry him out." And I took Chris's arm, and it was horrible. And I helped take him out. And when we got into the reception room, we tried just walking out of the room because Chris's dad, we were all just in a panic. You know, we didn't know if Chris was going to live or not. And the woman behind the desk there in the reception area, she started yelling at us, "You have to sign out. You have to sign out." And so we were made to go back and sign out from the facility. And then we hauled Chris out to the car and we threw him in the back seat. He was in and out of consciousness. And then when we got going down the road, I had to sit in the front with his dad, and we were pretty quiet. I didn't have much to say. And he drove us back to Idaho Falls, and Chris didn't become conscious until pretty much reaching Idaho Falls. He didn't start to come back to consciousness. And that whole drive, we didn't know if he was going to live, if he was going to die. And that was a horrible, horrible thing. And what they were doing was, after being presented to Hinckley, we were being put through what's called suicide programming. And so they were programming our mind with our body, that if we ever remembered the stuff we had lived through, we would automatically stop our own heart. And that was what that programming was. So spies, they don't carry these little cyanide pills anymore. They're put through suicide programming. There's communities I've heard, such as Army Rangers being put through programming in depth tanks. I had some friends who, here in Moscow, before I left Moscow, Idaho, one of my buddies, his dad was an Army colonel, 40-year Army colonel, and his brothers were involved in special ops. And my buddy said, "Yeah, my brothers aren't always allowed to remember their operations. They can't remember them. They're not allowed to." And I was like, geez, how prominent is this stuff? And at that time, that was when I was just starting to remember stuff, and I talked to him about it. And so we were put through suicide programming. And after that, I don't know how much time passed before we just drove back home to Nampa, and life just went on as normal again. I just was put back in my base personality, and life went on as normal. So that was my experience. If people can read about that in my journaled memories, it's The Other Side is what it's called. And then in 1995, I wasn't quite 18 years old yet. I was 17, and I was going to be put through what's called Pentagon level black operations testing, because when you turn 18 is when this testing usually happens, and that's when you're cleared not just for CIA work, like carrying messages and stuff like that, but you're cleared for actual CIA work, like assassinations, specific tasks for security, stuff like that. And so I was going to be put through my Pentagon level black ops testing, but they put me through when I was 17. I wasn't 18 yet, because the individual who did the testing, Chantel, was a man named Dick Cheney. Yeah, and Dick Cheney, he was going to go work for Halliburton. And so this was in, let me think now. This would have been 1995, towards the fall, late summer of 95, I want to say. And Cheney was going to go work for Halliburton. And when was that? Yeah, I think it was then. I'll have to look it up. Sometimes these things even get muddled for me a little bit. After you've remembered them, and they're not as
Uh,
crisp as when you first remember it. But I can remember I was 17, and I was working for my girlfriend's dad. And so my girlfriend, she was abused as well. Her father was ex-military and he was Mormon, and she was abused as well. And I would even be made to make pornography with her. I can remember we'd be put through programming together. One place that would occur was the Boise State Penitentiary. It's this old historic penitentiary where the CIA had some facilities there for human bioprogramming. And I can remember being made to make pornography with her. And her father, I worked for him as a delivery driver for furniture because he owned a furniture store. His name was Noel Hales, and he owned a furniture store called Heirlooms there in downtown Nampa, Idaho. And it was my last day of working for him and that summer. And he said, we're going to go to the Monkey Bar. It was a place we knew locally as just the Monkey Bar. And there was this bar there in town over by the railroad tracks where they had monkeys, like real live monkeys in the bar. That was part of their gimmick. And I'd heard about the Monkey Bar in my youth. My parents would talk about it sometimes, and my grandparents. And there's other things there I haven't quite worked out yet, so I won't talk about that. But he said, we're going to the Monkey Bar to pick up a piece of furniture that needs repaired. And that was supposed to happen at the end of the day. So the end of the day, we loaded up into the van, the work van, me and this other guy who worked for Noel, and we drove over to the Monkey Bar. And the boss man, Noel, he drove, and me and I believe his name was Dan, this other guy who I'd been working with all summer doing furniture delivery. And we drove over to the Monkey Bar, and we parked outside, and we walked around the building, and we got to the front door. Well, I'd been switching. Something had been happening. I'm not sure what, but I'd been switching. And at the door, I can remember looking at the sign, and it said, no one under 21 allowed, or something like that. And I said, oh, well, I can't go in. I can't go in there. I'm not 21. And they said, no, we're here for work. You can go inside. And I was like, okay, they talked me into going in. So we went inside and we walked up to the bar, and there was a guy there behind the bar, and we told him we're here to see the owner. And Noel, he said, oh, I'm going to go back and find him. The guy said he's back in his office. And so he went to go find him, and me and this other guy, we just stood there by the bar talking to this guy for a minute. And then he came back and got us after he'd been in the office and took us back there. And when we got to the door, they triggered me intentionally. They said, you're going to open the door to your future and go over the rainbow or something like that. Mm-hmm. And made to turn the knob and open the door. They'd make you do stuff like that to start the triggering process. And so I reached down and I started to turn the handle and open the door, and I'm switching in my mind at the same time. And we walked into this room, and there was a man sitting at a desk, and he wasn't a small man, and he had this hair that was just incredible. It was cut off. He had bangs. And then he had this weird mullet thing, and it was long. And then he had glasses on. And then he was wearing these clothes that looked like, he looked ridiculous. He was wearing these clothes that almost looked like country western mixed with Mad Max or something. Just so strange. And then my grandfather was there, and there was this other man there that I recognized. And then there was Noel, and I believe his name was Dan. He was there too. And this man sitting there, he finally looked up. He was filling out some kind of paperwork, and he got up from the desk and he walked over to me, and he said, stand at attention. And I stood at attention. And then he said, unbutton your shirt. And I started to unbutton my shirt. Well, I didn't do it fast enough for him. And he reached up and he just started to unbutton it. And I didn't know what was going on. because I didn't know if I was going to be used in a weird porno or what was going to happen. You never knew what was going to happen. And he unbuttoned my shirt and he pulled open my shirt. And there's a scar on my chest right there in the middle where my uncle and Charlie Pride and Senator Byrd and my uncle, he's worked in conjunction with one of his business partners with the CIA too, and he'd done it. And they programmed me with messages and stuff as a courier pigeon. And they would do that by sticking a knife in your chest called the key. They call it the key. And they twist that thing into your chest bone. And that was horrible. And so he opened up my shirt and looked at that scar and to make sure I was who I was, who they said I was. And then he said, let me see your wrist. And I showed him my wrist. And he looked at my two scars on this wrist, my left wrist, the two dots, which represent U.S. that I'm U.S. government property. And then he said, let me see your other wrist. And I showed him my right wrist where Bert had shoved the nail through my wrist. And he found that scar. And these were identifiers. So people looking for trauma-based mind slaves were not undetectable. You can find those scars. Those are huge scars. I've seen them on other trauma-based mind slaves, the chest scar as well as the scars on the wrists. And so he identified those, and then he told Noel to go get the girl, and then Noel had to go. He left the room, and then they came back. And when they came back, they had this girl with them. And I recognized the girl. She was a girl from high school. And they brought her in, and she looked pretty roughed up, Chantel. She didn't look very good. And I knew her. And I didn't know what was going to happen. I didn't know if they were just going to make us make a porno and they were going to record it or what they were going to do. Well, then Chini said, where's the gun? And my grandfather, my grandpa, he had his suit on and he had a gun. He had a 1911, a Colt 1911 45, and he pulled it out and he handed it to Chini. And then Chini, he loaded it, and then he put the safety on, and then he handed it to me. And he showed me how to use the safety on it, told me it was loaded, and showed me how to use the safety. And I was in a different personality, and I was very arrogant. And I can remember thinking, no shit, I know how to handle this weapon. You don't have to show me. And then there was a train coming because this bar was really close to the tracks. And they told the girl to get on her knees. And then she got on her knees. And they said, when the train comes, we'll tell you when to shoot. And the train kept getting closer and closer. And when the train got right there, I was made to shoot that girl, and I was made to shoot her in the head, Chantel. And she just collapsed. There on her knees, she just fell down. And I just remember looking at her. And that was that. And it was horrible, an absolute nightmare. And they were testing me to make sure that I would do whatever it is they said to do. And I did it because I was a trauma-based mind slave. And so they took me then, and I was taken behind. There were these cubicles in the room. The office had a lot of clutter in it, and there were these cubicles. And they took me around behind, and my grandfather had his pocket watch, and he hypnotized me to remember to forget. He made me drop my pants so he could access where they always would hit me with the stun gun. And then he hit me with the stun gun and fried me, just fried the hell out of me. And then when I came to, I couldn't understand where I was or what was going on. And they took me back around front, and Cheney was still there, and he had finished filling out his paperwork, and there was blood, and they were cleaning up the blood, and I was confused. My grandpa was there, and I was just so confused. And they said, furniture's this way. We have to go out this door. So they're already building the alibi on what had actually occurred. And they started taking me out this side door. Well, we went out the side door, and there was a fence, and we couldn't get to the truck very easily. And they didn't want to have to open the fence up or anything. So they said, well, let's just go back through. And so we just went back in. By the time we got back in, they'd finished cleaning everything up, or they finished cleaning it up. And then we left through the front the same way we'd come in. And I can remember leaving. And when we left, I remember there was this other kid there that was my age from high school. And he was sitting out in the bar with what looked like someone from his family or something. I don't know. That bar was popular with the gangs in Idaho. We had the Bloods and the Crips there in Idaho, in our town. And so we just left the bar, and we went outside and out to the van or the truck. And we went out to the truck, started loading up the furniture, because there was a piece of furniture there to load. And then my grandpa came, and I was so confused. I was like, what are you doing here? And he said he heard I was here, and he was just coming to see me. And he told me to come to his house that night. He wanted to watch a movie with me and hang out. And so that was arranged. And then he left, and we left, and we went and we drove the van back to the vehicle, the truck back to the furniture store. We parked it on the side, and it was such a hot day. It was so hot that day. And we parked on the side, and they just said, you can leave. We're not going to unload the furniture right now. And I was like, okay, you're sure you can do it alone? And they said, yeah, we'll take care of it later. And so I got back in my car. I had this little Toyota station wagon, and I got in my car and I drove home. Well, this was all a huge event for my family, because a lot of people in my family are involved with the agency, and they knew, some of them knew I was being tested on that day. And so I got home, and it was so hot outside, and my parents' house had such a contrast with the cold AC. And I went in, and I just said to my mom, I'm going to go take a shower. I need a hot shower. And so I went in. She said, well, take one in my room. Take a shower back in the master bedroom, in the bathroom there. Your dad's on his way, and he wants to talk to you too. And so my dad owned a computer business. And so I did what I was told, and I went back and I took a shower. And my dad showed up while I was still in the shower, and he came in to the shower, and he raped me in the shower, because they were trying to drive home the programming. They were still working on programming me that day. And so he raped me in the shower, and he talked to me about how I was supposed to go visit my grandpa and stuff like that. And so that night, when the time came, I finally drove over to my grandfather's house, and I went into the house. There was always a certain way we'd go in as relatives, and I went in through the garage and into the house. My grandma was there, and my grandma was involved with these things too. And she knew that I'd passed my Pentagon level Black Ops, and she congratulated me and said my grandpa would be excited to see me. And so I went upstairs, and my grandpa was up there, and I sat down with him, and we were going to watch a movie. The movie we were going to watch is the movie called Unforgiven. It's a movie that Clint Eastwood made. And I had started to watch it with my grandpa years ago, a couple years before. I believe it was summer of '93 after we'd come back from being back east and um, doing things like playing the most dangerous game and all that. And we didn't end up watching the whole movie because we were with some family friends who were awful people, by the way. And we ended up watching Benny and June. You remember that one that had Johnny Depp in it and somebody else, that gal? We ended up watching that instead because they didn't want to watch Unforgiven. And that night was a horrible night. That's a whole different story because that night I was raped by my grandfather there in McCall, Idaho. Yeah. And there's a large scar between my anus and my scrotum where my grandpa, he started to cut me open and he was going to remove my male genitalia. He said he wished that I'd been born a girl and that he hated how I was a boy and he was going to remove my genitalia and I was going to become a girl. And there's a very large scar there. And I've wondered for years, I had wondered for years what that was, what had happened to me until I remembered it. I remembered what had happened. And so my grandpa raped me that night and cut me up really good. But oh, I lost track. My grandpa and his house. I'm sorry, Chantel. And so that night, my grandpa said, we're going to watch a movie together. And he said, we're going to watch Unforgiven. He said he'd found it at a Goodwill or something, or Deseret Industries or something like that. And we were going to watch that. And part of me was like, oh no. And I don't want to go into all the details of that night. I had some really bad things happen to me again that night. And my grandpa talked to me though, and he told me who it was that I had met at the monkey bar. And he told me that man was Dick Cheney. And he said that man is going to be the vice president of the United States someday. He told me how it had all been planned out already. And he told me how those people, presidents, vice presidents, they are not chosen by the people. They do not leave that up to the people. He said those decisions are made by those in power, by the satanic elite, by the deep state, etc. And he said the people do not get to make that choice. The people in power make it. And so he told me how I'd met the future vice president of the United States. And that was really interesting to me. So I'm not one to go vote after I'd learned those things, after I'd remembered learning those things, I should say, because it's a sham. It's mockery of democracy. And so, so that was my experience with Cheney. Cheney was a very bad man. Now, after I'd gone to college, this was before I started to remember stuff. When I was in college and I was graduating, I graduated with honors from the University of Idaho and in landscape architecture. And my professor, who was originally from Japan, had tried to hook me up with working for a company out of Jackson Hole, Wyoming. I don't know if you know who had a house in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, but Dick Cheney had a home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I believe they were trying to place me closer to Dick Cheney after college graduation because they were always working on me through my college years, trying to make sure I would come back and that I was still usable. And so Dick Cheney, it was a scumbag, a complete scumbag. So that was my experience with Pentagon level testing for black operations for the agency. So after I passed my Pentagon level black ops in late summer of 1995, I was, I don't remember being used by the agency for anything too big until the spring of 96. And that was the following year. And I was used in a security detail in a place that we would refer to as the mountain. And this is the Trinity Mountain Underground Complex, and that's a top secret government facility located in Northern California. And Mount Shasta is part of that complex. And I was taken to a facility in Mount Shasta. And that was spring in 1996. This was spring break. And that was interesting because my grandmother had called me and she told me, I need you to come over to the house. I need you to drive over here with your car. And at that time, I drove my little Toyota station wagon, which had been my grandma's car. And so I drove that little car over there to pick her up because she told me she needed someone to drive her around town and be her escort that day. And I was like, okay, it's my grandma. Okay, I'll drive over and escort her around today. And so I drove over there. And when I got there, and she told me to dress nice too, by the way. And my grandma was always telling me that. And so I drove over there and went up and went inside, same way we always did. And my grandma, she said, well, you're not dressed nice enough, not for what we're doing today. And I was like, well, why not? And she made me put on a suit. She had a suit there, and I was made to put on a suit and a nice white shirt. And I had these sunglasses, but she didn't like them. She said, no, leave your sunglasses. You're not bringing those with you. And I was like, but my eyes are sensitive. See, as someone who was always hit with electricity from that stun gun, my eyes were very sensitive all the time because I was always being electrocuted. And so my grandma said, no, you're not allowed to bring those. And I said, well, where are we going, Grandma? And she said, well, you're going to take me to the airport, the Nampa airport, not even the Boise airport. This was this little Nampa airport. And okay, like, I guess so. And so we drove over to the Nampa airport and we parked out front, went inside, and the guy that was working in there, he was familiar with her. He was like, oh, how you doing? Where's your husband at? My grandpa. And she said, oh, he's not coming today. My grandson's going to escort me. And she was so proud that I was coming to escort her. She was so proud, Chantel, that I had passed my Pentagon level testing and that I was now able to do things like this, to escort her because she was going to Southern California to work on programming a specific individual. And so I was escorting her down there, and she didn't like having people that weren't in the family escort her. Sometimes she'd have to use people that were just random people who were cleared for this kind of work to escort her around the country. And so she was very proud that I was allowed to escort her now. And so she bragged about this to this guy, how I was now able to work to go with her. But she didn't talk about agency stuff or anything like that. I don't know how much he knew. And so, but we had a plane that was coming to get us, and it had two props on it. The wing was on the bottom, I can remember. And this plane was coming to pick us up, and we had to wait. We had to sign in for the plane, and then we sat down in the waiting area, and then the guy said, your plane's here. And we got in this golf cart outside, and it was a chillier day. It was March in Idaho. It was not always that warm, especially in March. And we took this golf cart over to the plane, which was waiting, and there were two pilots, and we talked to them for a minute, and we checked out the plane. And for me, I remember my grandma being like, what do you think of the plane? Isn't that awesome? What do you think of this? And I was just indifferent. I was like, it's a plane. So what? Like, who cares? People made it. I don't care. It's just a plane. And so we loaded up in this plane, and we were the only ones to get in this plane. It was just a little plane, but it was not tiny. It was, I don't know how to describe exactly how big it was, but we sat down in there, and the pilots got in, and they told us we were taking off. And then we took off, and we just started flying, and we flew down to Los Angeles to the LA airport from there. And this plane was really fast. It had two props on it, and so it could move. And they took us down to LA, and we landed at the LA airport. Well, it is really bright in LA in March. And we got down to LA and I didn't have any sunglasses. And so I just remember being blinded by all this light. And we got out of the plane and we took a cart. They had a lot nicer carts in LA than they did in Nampa. We got on this cart. It seems like it was a lot newer. And they drove us over to the airport where you check in from private flights. This wasn't a commercial flight. This was what would be considered a private flight. And so we went up to where you check in from a private flight and went inside, talked to some people there, signed in. And then after that, we went and just waited in a waiting area. And my grandma said we had to wait for somebody because my uncle was coming, my Uncle Gail. He was going to come and meet us there. He was my handler throughout a lot of my youth, I will just say. And so we sat down and waited. And then I was sitting across from my grandma and I could see my uncle come up and then he put his eyes over my grandma's eyes. It was all very friendly. And then he sat down with us and talked to us. And he said I needed to have some money because if I got separated from him, if I had to get back on my own, if I had to pay for anything, then I would need money. And he got out this giant wad of cash, just a huge wad of cash, and he gave me $1,000. And I was like, Gail, I don't need $1,000. Why are you giving me $1,000? And he said, put it in your pocket. And this was back in 96 when $1,000 was worth more. And he said, you need sunglasses. You can't be here in LA without sunglasses. You'll go blind here. And he said, I need to talk to your grandma anyway. Why don't you go down the hall? And there was a place down there that sells sunglasses. I saw them when I came in. You go down there and buy some sunglasses. So I said, okay, I'll go buy some sunglasses. So I walked down the hall, took my wad of cash, went down the hall, and I found some Ray-Bans and that I really liked. They looked like something Roy Orbison would wear or something. And I was like, oh, these look good, And so I paid for those. And then I walked back and showed her my sunglasses. And my grandmother approved of these sunglasses. She said, yeah, those will work. You can wear those. And so, yeah, this was my grandma, this is how she was. Yeah. And so my uncle had to use the bathroom. And so she got up and she went to the bathroom and my uncle sat there talking with me. Well, they were always feeding me drugs. And my uncle loved to give me drugs. When I was operational, they'd give me drugs. And so my uncle got out some drugs that he brought for me. We'd always call them potions. And he knew that what were my favorite ones. Mellow Yellow was one of them because it mellows you out. It just makes you feel euphoric. And he said, here, I brought you some of this so that you can enjoy yourself. And so just sitting right there in the airport terminal. And I can remember being like, well, but we're in the airport terminal, and it was like, well, but just don't act like it's a thing. Just, it's a mineral supplement. It's a whatever. And so I just drank this drug. And so then I was hyped up on drugs. And then he said he would meet up with me later. He told me I had to drop my grandma off at a hotel in Anaheim. And then after I dropped off my grandma, I had to go to the Disneyland facility and I had to go in through, what would you call it? Like an employee entrance. I had to go through an entry where people that work there would go. And so he explained how to get there. And I was like, okay, I've been here enough times. I can figure that out because I've been to Disneyland. I don't know how many times in my youth. And so he left and my grandma, she had a rental car. And so we went out to outside, and in LA, it was interesting because the weather is so nice there. These rental car places were kind of outside, inside, like it was all this weird mix. And we went to this car rental place, and I think I know exactly which one it was, but I won't say at this point. But we went there, and there was this guy there, and he recognized my grandma, and he was like, oh, where's your husband at? And she was like, well, he didn't come. And she said, this is my grandson, and he's escorting me on this trip. And he looked at me and he said, well, he's too young to drive. I could tell that because I was only 17. And so with the car rental company, you had to be a certain age. I forget if it was 21 or 24 or something like that. And he said, he's not old enough to drive, so you have to do the driving. And my grandma agreed, okay, I'll do the driving. Well, yeah, that didn't work out because my grandma made me drive. We got in the car and she drove a little way, but then she made me drive. And so I drove us around. We went to this gas station. I hadn't eaten much all day. And my grandma said, let's stop and get a snack. And there was this farm store and there in LA that my grandma had been going to for years and years and years because she is from the LA area too. And so she understood this place. We went there and she got some snacks. And I can remember I got a Snicker bar and a root beer, which were not good snacks to get because that would just make me sick. And I got some Starbursts too, these things called Starbursts, these little candies, a bag of them. And I would regret that later because all I was consuming was pure sugar. And then I started to crash because I hadn't eaten anything all day, hardly. And so we got a snack and then I drove my grandma. She explained how to get over to Anaheim. And we drove over to Anaheim on the freeway and pulled off down into Anaheim. And then my grandma explained how to get to her hotel. And I took her to this hotel, and it was a nice hotel. And we parked out front, and there was a valet, and he took the car, and me and my grandma went inside, and my grandma checked into her room, and I wasn't going to be allowed to stay there with my grandma. My grandma was going to be working on programming an individual that is involved in the film industry, and his name is Tom Cruise. She was going to be working on programming Tom Cruise. These people are trauma-based mind slaves, and they're being programmed. And so I dropped my grandma off there at her room. I can remember escorting her upstairs, and I wasn't accustomed to this ritzy of a place, and there was someone who brought her luggage there for her instead of me hauling it for her. And I was supposed to tip this individual, and they had to tell me. My grandma was like, well, give her a tip. Like, what are you doing? And so I gave her a tip, and then I had to leave the hotel. I went back out to the car and got in the car, and I drove over to Disneyland. It wasn't very far away. And I drove into the facility, and there was an employee only way to go. And I went that way to this gate, and I stopped at the gate, and I told them who I was and where I was going, and they pointed me where I was supposed to go. And they opened the gate, and I drove in, and I went and parked at this area for employees. And then there was this door that led down into the tunnel system under the park, because a lot of employees use that tunnel system too. And so I parked and I went to the door, and they had contacted my uncle to tell him that I was there. And so I just stood there and waited, and I was standing there, and I was eating Starbursts, and my uncle, because I put a bunch of them in my suit pocket, and my uncle finally came, and I remember he opened the door and he was like, what are you eating? And I said, I was eating Starbursts. And I said, do you want one? And he took one. He said, yeah, I'll take one. And he laughed at me because in programming and in the satanic elite and in the Luciferian culture, stars are very important. They can be upright or they can be inverted. And so we were what were considered stars. I was a star in the child porn industry, essentially. And so, as well as a chosen one in the project. And so this was played off of in my programming and in my mind with those starbursts. And then he said, well, come follow me. And then we took this tunnel and we went down to this place that I often refer to as the family layer. I think we talked about it before. And I went in and we sat down in the family layer, and there's this place in there where you can watch all the screens. It's like a NASA control center, a small one, where you can watch spies and different mind slaves around the globe and work with them. Or there's an area where you can actually take a break for those people working in there. And there's like a break area. And so we sat down in the break area, and my grandpa, he was doing something at the computers, and we told him we were there. And my uncle showed me this thing he had. He goes, "What do you think of this?" And it was the prop from the movie Batman, the one with Jim Carrey. It was the fortune teller inside the box thing. And he was like, "What do you think of this?" I just picked this up because he bought it from whoever it was that he bought it from, involved in Hollywood. And it was a prop there in the room. And he was like, "What do you think of that?" And I can remember being like, "Well, what are you talking about? How did my aunt, I'm not going to say her name, but his wife, how did she allow you to buy this?" And he said, no, I didn't buy it. It's bought with agency funds. Like, this is an agency fund purchase. So they'll do things like that, like use money to buy stuff like that. I can remember, like I was talking in the last interview about the set for Star Trek, that first set from the very first Star Trek film or recording. And so they'll buy stuff like that from Hollywood. And we talked about that for a minute. And then my uncle, he was really into coke. So he did some cocaine, and he gave me some more drugs. My grandpa came up and started talking to us. And then I can remember at some point, John showed up, John Lilly. He heard I was in town in LA, and he was over from Hawaii. He worked in Hawaii. He studied dolphins a bunch and did a bunch of stuff. And he was getting older, and it was slowing him down some, but he was in LA for some reason, and he wanted to see me, and he wanted to talk to me because he hadn't been able to talk to me since my experience at INEL. And he wanted to hear about what that was like, having them stop my heart in one of his tanks. And so we talked about that for a little while. And my uncle, he had left when John showed up, I believe, and he ran to get what he called our chariot. He called it my chariot, which was a helicopter. There was a helicopter because Disneyland was going under construction at that time. And it was easy for them to land a helicopter over in that construction zone, and no one would pay any attention. And then he came back after he'd verified that our helicopter was ready to go, and we left, and we went up on the roof of the Alice in Wonderland ride. And I can remember we went across the roof and went through some different ways in order to get over to where the helicopter was. There were lots of back ways through the park. And we got there, and there was this little helicopter, and we loaded up into that. And then we just took off. We got in and we took off. And I can remember putting on my headset and being able to communicate. But then they could turn off my headset so that I couldn't hear what they were saying, and I couldn't talk to them. And I can remember when we took off, I looked at everyone at the park below me who was just like someone at the park at Disneyland. And I was like, "Dale, these people are looking at us. They can see us right here taking off." And he was like, "It doesn't matter. Who cares? The helicopters take off from here all the time. No one notices." And he said, "Besides, you're a star, and some of these people might be your fans." And he was talking about my work in the child porn industry. And I was just, in my mind, it was all, a lot of that stuff's compartmentalized. And so I'm trying to process it as we're flying away. And then my uncle tells me he's hungry and he wants to stop before we go out to the mountain because he'd arranged for me to be involved with a guard detail for the agency at this big satanic ritual that I was supposed to be in the guard detail over because I'd been cleared for Pentagon level black operations. And so he told me, "While your grandmother is working on programming Tommy, you're going to be going over here because you can't hang out with your grandma. You got to go, and I've arranged for you to be in this guard detail at the mountain." And so, but he said, "I want to stop and have dinner first." So he took us into LA. We had to go to LA to the airport to catch our plane out of there. To go to the mountain anyway, at least to the end, one of the entrances to the mountain. And so we were flying in our helicopter. I call them airships sometimes. That might happen, so I apologize. But we were flying, and there was this big skyscraper there in LA, and we just landed right on the roof of it. Now, when we landed, or shortly before, my uncle was talking to the pilot. And one of the ways they do stuff, Chantel, okay, this is really important because this helicopter was doing a flight lesson. This man flying this helicopter was doing a flight lesson with this young woman. This young woman was a CIA trauma-based mind slave. And this guy who was flying was in on the know. So we had arranged this helicopter flight because this individual who was the pilot was in the network, and he was making extra money along with his helicopter work of teaching people how to fly. He was making extra money by taxiing us from the Disneyland theme park back over to the airport. So my uncle said to him, well, look, while we're eating, I want you to take this woman. I want you to refuel the aircraft, but I also want you to abuse her. I want you to work on her programming for me because I can't do it right now. And so he gave my uncle the keys to abuse this woman, her triggers. And then we went inside to eat into this building, and they took off to refuel, and he was going to go abuse this girl who was also a trauma-based mind slave, who he was also teaching how to fly. So this is how these things can be done, you know? And so we went inside this hotel, or not hotel, I apologize, this skyscraper, and there was a restaurant in there, and we went down into the restaurant and we sat down. Now, this was a really bourgeois restaurant. I don't know if I've ever been in anything this fancy. And we were sitting there and we got our menus. I remember the waiter was a man. I came from the West where you'd go out to eat and you'd eat something like chicken fried steak, and the menu would be brought to you usually by a waitress. And this was a waiter. And I couldn't even read the menu. I was like, I don't know what I should get because I can't even read it. And my uncle was like, I'll order for you. You're going to have this. It'll be fine. And okay, I was happy to let him order for me. And then we waited for a while. Well, then we heard this laughing in the background, this loud laughter. And we were like, what is that? What is that noise? And turned around, and my uncle was just like, oh no, that's Leo. It was Leonardo DiCaprio, and he had turned 21 sometime before, and he had gotten to where he likes to drink, and he would go out in public and he would drink, and he wouldn't just drink like, let's go have a beer or two. He would go and he would drink to the point where he would black out. When you talk to him, he'd say, I'm drinking, I'm getting drunk tonight. I'm drinking. And so when he gets drunk, he has this laugh that is just, it's the signature laugh for Leo. I'm just going to say that. And so my uncle was like, oh no, Leo's over there getting drunk. And so we ended up eating our dinner. And then after we finished, my uncle said, I want to go talk to Leo because my uncle was a CIA human bioprogrammer. And Leo is a CIA trauma-based mind slave. And so we got up and we walked over to Leo in the bar, and Leo, he knew who my uncle was. My uncle was like, hey, Leo, what are you doing? And Leo was just like, oh, hey, Gail, how are you doing? What are you doing here? And they just talked for a minute. And my uncle told Leo how he shouldn't be getting drunk. You shouldn't be getting drunk like this. You're making an ass of yourself. What are you doing? Because they really worry about the image of those people. The image we were talking about earlier is very tightly contained around those individuals. The story, bless you.
Excuse me.
You're okay. I'll try to finish this one up.
Go.
Yeah. And so Leo, he didn't like what my uncle was saying, and he just kind of shrugged him off and was like, I don't want to listen to you, Gail, And so Gail, he said, well, I got to go use the restroom. He said, you hang out and you talk to Leo while I go use the restroom. So I sat down by him, and my uncle went to use the bathroom, and I was too young to drink. I was only 17, but Leo was smoking, and I was like, well, I'll have a cigarette, And Leo was like, okay. And so we just sat there and smoked cigarettes. And we just talked. We just talked for a little while. And, that poor guy, he has been put through hell. When I was having dinner with my uncle told me that Leo's father was even more horrid than my own. He told me how Leo had a horrible family, a horrible father who had brutally abused him. And so Leo's all messed up. And we just hung out and talked. And part of it, I believe, from him was just sitting down and actually talking to someone close to his age who you could just have a normal conversation with. Because Leo doesn't trust anybody. There's maybe a few in his world he trusts, but you can't just walk up and sit down by Leo and talk to him. And so for him, I believe, to sit down and just talk with someone. And before my uncle left, he told Leo, he's involved with film too. You can talk to him. He's someone who's also involved with filmmaking. And he wasn't lying. I was involved with making porn as a kid. And so Leo and I, we just talked for a little while. And I don't know how long Gail was gone, but we smoked a cigarette and Leo was getting drunk. And I just remember saying, "What are you doing?" To Leo. I said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm getting drunk." And I was like, "Well, why? Why would you do that? How are you going to feel tomorrow after you wake up from getting this drunk?" Because it was confusing to me because I was this Mormon kid growing up in Nampa, Idaho. And I don't know if by that time in my life I'd ever really gotten that drunk. I'll have to journal about that because I don't know that I did. And I was like, "Well, you're going to hurt tomorrow." I must have done it at some point. But regardless, we talked for a while. And then my uncle came out of the bathroom and he said, "It's time to go." And I said, "Okay." And I got up and I said goodbye to Leo and we just left. And when we started walking away, Leo told the bartender to send for his car. He said, "I'm leaving. I want my car. Send for my car." And so the bartender called in for his car. And when my uncle and I got up to a certain point going towards the airship, the helicopter, he stopped me in the hall and he said, "What did you say? What did you say to Leo?" He was really curious because he was involved with controlling people, manipulating people, human bioprogramming. And he said, "No one has ever been able to get Leo to just quit drinking. How did you do it? What did you do?" And I just told him all I did was sit down and talk to him. That's all I did. And my uncle was just blown away. And so I was actually brought in again in the year 2000 in Sun Valley, Idaho. Leo was in Sun Valley. He'd given some kind of talk there in Sun Valley, and I was brought in because he was getting drunk again at the bar in Sun Valley at the lodge. And so I was brought in to get him to quit making an ass of himself at that bar. But that's a whole different story. So I won't go into that right now. But we went back up on the building and we loaded back up into our helicopter. And the helicopter took us to the LA airport. And then at the LA airport, we loaded up onto a government aircraft. It was a flight that takes people out to places like Area 51. And it was in between flights. And so it had a little time. And so we were able to now take that plane and fly to where we flew to access the mountain. And so I can remember getting on that plane. It was a bigger plane. It wasn't a small plane. That was a bigger plane. And we loaded up onto that plane. We were the only ones on the plane other than the two pilots. And they took us to a place, and I believe I know where that place was. I don't talk about it. I think I know exactly where it was, but we were taken to this landing strip. It was by a large body of water, by a lake, and there were mountains, there was a river, and there was a door we ended up going into and accessing the facility. And from there, I can remember moving through a tunnel system And we finally came to a place where this individual came to meet us, and he was in BDU's battle dress uniform, and he was armed. He had an HK MP5 submachine gun, and he was really glad to see us because we had come. He said, "I'm glad you're here to help with the security detail," because they were thin on security. See, going back to Dick Cheney, when Dick Cheney did my testing, they had to push me through when I was 17 because Cheney was about to go work for Halliburton. And when he went to work for Halliburton, he wasn't going to be able to do any more testing. And they didn't have anyone lined up to do the testing because you have to have a real evil SOB to do that testing. And they didn't have anyone in the network that they could just plug into that yet. So the network was a little thin there in early 1996 of people who were cleared for this kind of work. And so this individual was like, "We're really glad to see you. Follow me. I'll take you to the CO and get you guys set up." And so we went and followed this guy to this room in the tunnel system where they had basically a command center set up. It looked pretty makeshift. They had a fold-out table, just like a folding table with computer, and there were screens, and there were firearms on some racks on the wall, communication devices. And there was this guy, he was the CO, and then there was this other guy with him. He must have been a second in command, and he was operating the computers and the video screens, because they had cameras set up all over in the tunnel system. And the CO said he was happy to see us, but my uncle said, "Well, I'm not staying. I'm not going to stay and be a part of the guard detail. I got to go." And when the CO heard that and he looked at me, he got really pissed, Chantel. He said, "You brought me this kid." It is incredible how mean these people be to each other even. And it was just a barrage of cussing and yelling. And "You have orders." This guy would not accept me until my uncle ordered him to accept me for this guard detail. And I believe he had orders right there. He had a case with him, and he had his orders there with him. And the guy said, "Okay, then I have to take this kid." And then my uncle told him to give me a gun. And the guy said, "No, I'm not giving him a gun. I refuse to." And that was interesting because then they started arguing about that. "I'm not giving this kid a gun. He's not even old enough to have one. What are you talking about?" And then my uncle had to order him to give me a gun because it was dangerous in the mountain. There's things in that mountain that are evil that I don't understand. There's some entity that lives in that mountain, Mount Shasta, and we referred to it as the slough. But I don't know if that's just a military term or what, but we called them the slough. And so he wouldn't give me a gun, and then he finally got orders to give me a gun. And so he gave me a submachine gun. It was an HK MP5. And my uncle said, "Give him ammo for it." He wouldn't give me ammo for it. In the end, he wouldn't give me any bullets for it. But I was put out in the tunnel system, and I was made to do guard duty. Now, my uncle told me originally that he was going to be there to help me with guard duty, and he was going to be around, and he was going to be in the mountain too. But then he changed his story, and he said he had to leave because Britney Spears was being put through programming and abuse at Bohemian Grove at that time. And he said, I'm going to go be involved in that. I'm going to go get in on some of that. And he talked to me about that for a little while. And so he ended up leaving me there to go be involved with abusing Britney Spears. And so that was a really bad deal. And people will say, "Oh, but Bohemian Grove, women aren't even allowed in there." Yeah, well, that's nice. I'm not talking about walking in the front door. I'm talking about someone being taken there specifically for abuse and programming. And so I don't give a shit what people say. And so that's a terrible deal. Poor Brittany is in a bad way. And so I was left there, and I was made to put on BDUs in this locker room, bathroom, and then I was made to be involved in this guard detail. And the things that I saw in that mountain were horrendous. Um,
I would love to. That in itself would be a few shows of what you experienced in that area, right? What you saw.
yeah, there's a lot there,
Mm,
Chantel.
mm.
There is a lot there. I don't want to rush through it. People can read
Mm.
about it too on my website or in my book, and it's documented there. But we can talk about that the next time that we chat. We,
Yeah, I'd love
we've been
to.
talking
Oh.
for quite a while, and if I keep talking, we're going to be here for 3 hours today. And I'm getting
Well,
bored out, and I'm sure you are too. So,
no, I'm more concerned about you, obviously. So yeah, we've 2.25 hours. I think that's probably a record for us, yeah. But wow, what a story, JR. I mean, I listen to you and my heart breaks 10 times a second when I hear what you've been through, and not just you, but the people, the other kids
yeah,
who have been subjected to these monsters. I mean, oh, but there again, at the end of the day, these monsters were kids once too, unfortunately, who were tortured and abused and didn't have the courage or the aptitude, if you want to call it that, to actually stay in the light, and not get sucked in down into that dark hole.
and not break
And
free. Not break free. There are
yeah,
still slaves.
exactly. And that is why it is so amazing to have someone like you on the show. And I've been watching the comments. There have been quite a few comments. Your recollection is amazing. You have such a good recollection, and the way you actually tell the story, is very coherent, and it's easy to follow, and it's easy to understand. And as much as what it's horrifying. I mean, I can't imagine, as a non-survivor in this life, I can't imagine what you must have been through. But thank you for sharing. And I know the courage it takes, and I can see, obviously how it still affects you. And thank you for that, because not just what you're going through every day emotionally, but this horrific harassment that you face every day, and are still prepared to come out and share your story, which literally enlightens us, as well as it saves so many other children. Every time someone speaks, there are
Yeah.
children that are not going to be taken to the gallows in that way. So thank you, JR. I want to really just say thank you. I have questions, but I'm going to leave them for next time, um, because it has been a lot today. And thank you, Lisa D. I'm just going to pop JR's book there. And guys, I want to encourage you to purchase the book. It really is. It's also how we support our survivors. They've been through hell and back. Buy a copy of the book, support the survivors, get to know the story, share it with whoever you know. The days of us being told that we're crazy and we're mad and what have you, those days are over. If we're looking at what's happening coming out of the Epstein files now we're seeing who enforced the jab, and any normie can make that connection, right? So this is why we share these stories, like little things like this. Jerry, your story is extreme, and thank you again, for opening up and having the courage to speak to us about that. I'm wondering, is there anything, just in closing, you'd like to say to our viewers, where they can find you, any other interviews you're doing at the moment? We're definitely going to have you back again. At the moment, our timeline with Jara is about every 2 weeks on a Sunday. So Jara and I will discuss the follow-up show and what it's going to be about. But yes, we will definitely see you again. So anything else on the horizon for you, and anything in closing for us?
I want to thank your audience, yeah, thank you for hearing these things. These things aren't easy to talk about, and I know they're not easy to listen to. You know, for me, Chantel, I have to talk about these things, and I have talked to a lot of people about it, and I always see what people go through when I even have to talk about it. And so, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time um, to listen to these things. These things are very important. And so, I really appreciate your audience. Thank you. And I don't know. I'm really wore out. I'm going to have to take some rest. And
Mm,
yeah, just
absolutely.
thank you, Chantel. Yeah.
God bless you. And thank you for sharing. And yes, even though it is healing to talk for all of us, I know it takes its toll on you. So thank you. We appreciate you very much. Thank you to our amazing viewers for, you guys are amazing. I just love you guys for always being there for our guests and just being such a supportive team. Thank you so much. I will see you guys back tomorrow with Miles Johnston at 4 o'clock from the Basis Project. And yeah, my schedule's kind of back to normal again from now, this week. So yeah, show's back to normal, but watch the schedule. New things on as well. We're always doing things on Ara. Take good care, everybody. God bless you all. Have a beautiful week. Stay strong, stay centered, and yeah, just stay kind and stay cool. That really is the weapon we need. JR, thank you again so much. God bless and lots of strength to you. We'll see you next time. Thank you, everybody. Mwah.